so much, Ika. Thank Dr. Swinburn and the entire organizing committee for inviting me all the way to Auckland. I have already, just in the last 3 hours, been called a savior and a zealot all at the same time. I am none of those things. I'm a scientist. I'm a real scientist, as opposed to some other scientists. And we're going to talk about that. And it's about the science. I am here because of the science. I also take care of children. And children are getting a very raw deal. And it's time to fix the problem. And that's what we, as a group, intend to do. So, first of all, I have no disclosures, no food industry concerns putting me up to this, I promise you. All right, so, in 2011, 2 years ago, the UN Secretary General said that non-communicable disease, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, is now a bigger problem for not just the developed world, but the developing world than is acute infectious disease, including HIV. This means a reallocation of resources worldwide. And the question is, how does one accomplish that, especially in places where all of these diseases commingle? They plan to target tobacco. That makes sense. They plan to target alcohol. That makes sense. And then they plan to target diet. Well, what about diet? Total calories? You know, they've been doing that for the last 30 years with absolutely no success. And you know Einstein's theory of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. How about fat? We've been doing that for the last 30 years with the same result. Red meat? Harvard School of Public Health says red meat's a problem, especially processed red meat. Dairy, Caldwell and Esselstyn in the China studies say it's casein in dairy products. Carbohydrate, the Glycemic Index Foundation, who might be attending here, would say it's all about carbohydrate. Who's to believe? Do you believe any of these people? Here's the problem on this slide. This is the biggest problem we have today in the entire world. It's on this slide. It is Coca-Cola's coming together slide from their campaign from last year. And they say that beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. In other words, you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or anything else with a C. It doesn't matter where the calories come from. A calorie is a calorie. You eat too much, you exercise too little, it's your fault. And they even say so in the video. Common sense. Well, you know what? I don't believe in common sense. I believe in data. And the data say something completely different. What the data say is that some calories cause disease more than others because different calories are metabolized differently, because a calorie is not a calorie. An example, fiber. Fiber makes carbohydrates safe because it reduces the insulin response. It also reduces total food consumption because it generates a satiety signal sooner. It also activates the microbiome so that the bacteria in your intestine get it before you do, because a calorie is not a calorie. Protein. Protein costs twice as much to burn for energy as does carbohydrate, plus protein is satiating. Plus there are opioid receptors in the intestine that respond to amino acids to change your level of hunger, because a calorie is not a calorie. How about fat? So there's omega-3s, which are heart healthy and are anti-inflammatory and will save your life. And then there's trans fats, which will kill you. They're both 9 calories per gram. If a calorie were a calorie, it wouldn't matter. But it does. And finally, of course, the topic of today, fructose. So everybody knows what we're talking about. High fructose corn syrup on the top. 1 glucose, 6-membered ring. 1 fructose, 5-membered ring. But look down below. Sucrose, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff you put in your coffee, the stuff you have here in New Zealand. 1 glucose, 1 fructose, O-glycosidic linkage, linking the two. The enzyme sucrase in your intestine cleaves this in about a nanosecond. You absorb the 2 moieties. It's irrelevant. Now, Dr. Johnson says that there is some reason to be concerned specifically about HFCS. That very well may be true. The data are not in yet in humans, so we have to wait on that. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is in these 2 popular journal articles. The first one, the New York Times Magazine, Is Sugar Toxic?, written by Gary Taubes about our research at UCSF. And the second one, called The Toxic Truth About Sugar, a Nature comment that I put out with my colleagues, Drs. Laura Schmidt and Claire Brindis from the Institute for Health Policy Studies. And I will tell you, I have gotten more heat over these two items than I can possibly tell you, because they say, oh, this is hyperbole. How can sugar be toxic? What, are you joking? It's been around for thousands of years. We put it in our coffee. We like it. It's motherhood and apple pie. Rubbish, they say. Is it? So let's talk about what the word toxicity means. This is the definition. The degree to which a substance can damage an organism. That's the definition of toxicity. It does not distinguish between acute toxicity or chronic toxicity. Acute toxicity, you keel over and die. Chronic toxicity, that happens slowly, insidiously, over thousands of meals, not over a single one. Now, the requisites that I have to use in order to prove that fructose or sugar is toxic are the following. It must be an independent risk factor. It cannot be related to its calories, and it cannot be related to obesity. Otherwise, it's just about the calories, and then Coca-Cola would be right. I have to show that this is unrelated to calories, unrelated to obesity, and I have to not just establish correlation, which is what's been done up till now, I have to establish causation. This is my charge. This is my bar, and if I don't meet it, run me out on a rail. Okay? Put me back on the plane, and I'll go home tonight instead of tomorrow. The criticisms of fructose toxicity are, well, these are animal studies. You have to give an enormous amount. Dr. Johnson's studies that he showed you earlier today, you have to really overload the animal. They're not human studies. We have to administer excessive doses. What does this have to do with the tea in China? So I will limit my discussion today to human data only, human consumption only, and in doses routinely used by people on the planet. Those are my charges. Everybody got it? You with me? Here we go. So let's start with sugar and obesity. So, number one, sugar and obesity do not correlate perfectly. So there's refined sugar in the blue, there's obesity in the orange, there's high fructose corn syrup entering up in the red. And when you add it all up, you see that it doesn't really correlate as nicely as you would like. And that's true. There's something missing from the slide. Anybody know what it is? It's fruit juice. There's fruit juice now. Okay. Bottom line, it still doesn't correlate beautifully. And I agree with that. So here's U.S. sugar consumption. Dr. Johnson showed a similar slide earlier. Going from 4 pounds a year up to our current 110 pounds a year. There has been a slight decrease over the last 5 to 10 years because of the advent of diet soda, because of the obesity epidemic. So here's the growth of the sugar industry. Here's World War II and stabilization. And here's high fructose corn syrup entering back in 1980. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Now, what are the foods that cause weight gain? We know. Number 1 and number 2, potato chips and French fries. I agree. Potato chips and French fries. Fat and carbohydrate at the same time. And it causes weight gain for all the reasons that Dr. Johnson told you about. I agree. So here's sugar-sweetened beverages and sweets and desserts, distant third. Agreed. In correlative studies, sugar-sweetened beverage consumption increases weight gain in toddlers on the left, and prospectively in inner-city Harlem toddlers in juice servings per day on the right. Again, not causative, correlative, but prospective. This just came out 2 weeks ago. This is from the OECD, and it looks at fast food transactions worldwide over time, over a decade, looking at the change in BMI during that decade as a function of how many fast food transactions each country had. Now, granted, this is country data, not individual data. That's true. But it's got a time series in it, which makes it much more potent. And you can see fast food definitely correlates. But is it that obese people are eating fast food, or is it that fast food causes obesity? You can't tell from this. But when you look a little bit harder at the data, so there's the effect of fast food right there in the blue. When you take out the soft drinks, it all goes away. It's all about the soft drinks, because when you take out the animal fat or the total calories, It doesn't matter. It's about the soft drinks. The soft drinks were the thing that made the fast food be the arbiter of total weight gain. That makes it much more likely that the directionality is that the fast food is causing the weight gain via the soft drinks as opposed to not. But it's still not causation. Agreed. Correlation, not causation. Dr. Tamaranga will show this slide. This is her work from earlier last year, showing the diamond for both of these is not crossing zero, so that raising or lowering sugar definitely contributes to increasing or decreasing weight gain. No argument. But when you do the math, this is worth about 0.8 BMI points. We have a 7 to 8 BMI point problem. So the sugar portion of it only accounts for about 10%. But I also want to point out that it depends on who did the study. Because this just came out showing that if the food industry sponsored the study, most of them showed no association, whereas if the study was independent, then most of them showed a very clear association between sugar beverages and obesity. So instead of reading the abstract and looking at the conclusion, how about start reading the funding source? And every nutritional paper published today needs to have the funding source put at the very top of the article. Now, the food industry will say, but wait a second. Fructose for glucose exchange studies show no significant difference there, right there. This is the work of Stephen Piper. But in hypercaloric trials, it does. So what does that mean? It means that what you have to do is you have to overload the system in order to see the effect of fructose on weight gain. Well, the fact is we're all overloaded because we're all eating 300 calories more than we were 25 years ago, consistently. So there is no such thing as isocaloric, there's only hypercaloric. And if you take the beverages away, what happens? Well, the BMI goes down, and it especially goes down in Latinos quite a bit. So there's some mechanistic studies. So does sugar cause weight gain? Sure. Is sugar a cause of obesity? In some, likely. Is sugar the cause of obesity? Not even remotely close. Not even close. Okay? Because it's all about the calories, isn't it? Now, I already spoke with Dr. Mann during the break, and I just want to show how, if it's about the calories, we lose. I think the sugar story has been very confused by people who have exaggerated the badness of sugar, meaning me. Sugar is not inherently a bad substance. It's a bit like if you like a bit of sugar on your cereal, that's fine. But what you don't want is an excessive intake in sugar for the amount of calories that you need. Well, if a calorie is a calorie, then why would it matter? I think the problem over the years is that you've had two camps. You've had people who said sugar is a disaster, it's the cause of ill health, which it clearly isn't. I would argue that. And that you have people, particularly the sugar industry, that has understandably rubbished that. As far as I'm concerned, this is playing into the hands of the food industry. And Dr. Tamaranga, about the same paper, not about the same paper, just 3 weeks ago, said in New Scientist, all sugared sweetened drinks really do is contribute calories to the diet, but without making you full. In other words, a calorie is a calorie. But I've already shown you a calorie is not a calorie. So the problem is, if a calorie is a calorie, then really the only thing you're looking at is obesity. You're only looking at this calories in, calories out. You're only looking at this first law of thermodynamics. You're not looking at this as an independent risk factor for disease, because obesity is not the problem. Obesity never was the problem. Obesity is what the food industry wants us to believe is the problem, because people don't die of obesity. Metabolic syndrome is the problem. In particular, diabetes. That's the problem, because that's where the money goes. So let's put this slide back up. Now let's draw some thresholds. So there's the AMA threshold for cardiovascular disease that came out in 2009, which I was a co-writer of. And here's the theoretical threshold based on alcohol, if you believe the alcohol analogy. Dr. Johnson told us that in 1924, Haven Emerson of the New York City Department of Health said that diabetes was related to sugar. I did not know that, and so I will update these slides accordingly. When was the next time that anybody realized that we had a chronic metabolic syndrome crisis? Anybody know? 1931. With Paul Dudley White's treatise called Heart Disease, he was the head of cardiology at Mass General, and he saw the increase in heart disease that was going on nationwide. So you can see where that temporally relates to the stabilization. And then the second one was in 1988 when we realized that there was the emergence of type 2 diabetes in children, which had never been seen before. In 1980, there were 0 cases, and today there are 57,000 cases in America, and I'm sure there are plenty of them here in New Zealand. So if you look at the correlation, this is temporal correlation, pretty impressive. But, of course, correlation is not causation, and I'm a scientist, and I got to do better than that. Here's the problem. This is a Venn diagram of the American adult population. 30% obese, 70% normal weight. And the standard mantra, what everyone believes, is that 80% of those obese people are metabolically ill. They get type 2 diabetes, they get hyperlipidemia, they get cardiovascular disease, they get cancer, they get dementia. They are sick. Those 80% of those obese people are sick. And they are chewing through all the healthcare resources of our country and every other country, here in New Zealand too, and if they would only just diet and exercise, we could solve this problem. Rubbish. That is rubbish. And here's why it's rubbish. Yes, 80% of obese people are metabolically ill. But that means 20% of obese people are metabolically healthy. They will die at a completely normal age, not cost the taxpayer a dime. They do not have insulin resistance. They are not the problem. 20% are metabolically healthy. Conversely, up to 40% of the normal weight population have the exact same metabolic dysfunctions and the exact same metabolic diseases as do the obese. They get hypertension, they get type 2 diabetes, they get dyslipidemia, they get cardiovascular disease, they get cancer, they get dementia. They get it at a slightly lower rate, sure, but when you do the math, it's actually more than the obese, the sick obese adults. When you add it up, it's more than half the American population. So if it happens to normal weight people, how can it be about the calories? Because it's not about the calories. It was never about the calories. It's not a behavior, it's an exposure. It's something these people are exposed to, and it's something these people are exposed to. And it has nothing to do with the calories. It's exclusive of calories. If you believe a calorie is a calorie, we can't win. If you believe a calorie is not a calorie, the world opens up. Because then the question is, which calories are the problem? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about sugar and heart disease. This came out just last week, February 3rd. Sorry, 2 weeks ago now. And I just met with Frank, who in Montreal just 3 days ago. And you can see here that the hazard risk ratio for heart disease death, the inflection point's at 15% of calories. So it's not about total calories, it's about percentage of calories as sugar. And this is over a decade. This has the time series in it. And the median is 18%. So in other words, more than half of the adult US population has an increased risk for cardiovascular mortality due to their current consumption of sugar. And if you go out all the way on the end here to 30% and 33%, which is what our kids are doing, the hazard risk ratio for heart disease death is 4-fold. Now, this is also not causation, but it's a hell of a good correlation. And it's prospective, and it's got time series. This is very, very potent. Now, let's do diabetes, where we have the most data. So I have to give you 5 separate pieces of data, and I'm going to build the case. So we have to talk about the confound with obesity, plausibility, mechanisms, human correlation, and human causation. And we will do all 5. So let's start with confound by obesity. So here's the prevalence of obesity worldwide, and here's the prevalence of diabetes worldwide. Now, there's very clearly a correlation between the two, but you know what? There are a lot of countries that are obese without being diabetic, and there are a lot of countries that are diabetic without being obese. They do not overlap. They are not concordant. That's true. And worse yet, obesity is increasing worldwide at the rate of 1% per year, yet diabetes is increasing worldwide at the rate of 4% per year. If diabetes is a subset of obesity, if diabetes is due to obesity, if obesity is the cause of diabetes, how could you explain that? You can't, because that ain't true.
Now let's talk about plausibility. Everybody know what this is. This is normal liver. This is fatty liver. Fatty liver disease. The question is it alcohol fatty liver disease or sugar fatty liver disease? You can't tell. I know the answer because I took the picture, but you can't tell because they look exactly the same, because they are the same. The substrate that starts it is different, but how they are handled in the liver is exactly the same, and that's the point. Non-alcoholic, alcoholic, irrelevant, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is now enormous. 1/3 of America. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the liver phenomenon that is metabolic syndrome. And it correlates with obesity, of course, and it correlates in children as well. 45% of Latinos in America today, 33% of Caucasians, and for reasons that are still unclear, 1/4 of African Americans, they seem to be protected. Many of these will go on to develop inflammation and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and 25% of those will either die of their liver disease or need a liver transplant. And it turns out that this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a primary predictor of type 2 diabetes in the Korean population. Now, this is the most important slide I'm going to show you. This is Fabrini et al. This is work from WashU St. Louis and Sam Klein's group. And what they did was they did slices across the belly to measure visceral fat, fat around your belly, and also liver fat, not subcutaneous fat, liver fat versus visceral fat. And they asked the question, which explains the disease better, the visceral fat or the liver fat? And it turned out when you held the liver fat constant, the visceral fat had no effect, no phenomenon. Whereas if you held the visceral fat constant, the liver fat explained everything. That was the thing that made you insulin resistant, was the liver fat, not the visceral fat. So anything that drives liver fat is your problem. So the question is, where'd the liver fat come from? Here in gray, non-systemic fatty acids, non-systemic. Now, systemic fatty acids, we know where those come from. Those come from the adipose tissue, or they come from the diet. Non-systemic, where do those come from? Those come from right in the liver itself. Okay? It's made right in the liver. It's called Denovo lipogenesis, new fat making, and that is what Rick talked about earlier, and something that sugar does in particular. So let's now talk about mechanisms. So the common wisdom, again, is a calorie is just a calorie, and sugar is just empty calories, so why would it matter if you ate sugar or anything else? Just keep your calorie allotment down. That's what everyone outside this room believes. Maybe some people inside this room still believe that. But if so, I'll take you outside later. Problem is that chronic fructose exposure promotes liver fat accumulation, which promotes the metabolic syndrome directly. And chronic fructose exposure induces protein glycation, which makes your cells less flexible, makes your membranes less flexible, driving the cellular aging process. So let me show you how that works. So here's glucose entering the liver, and it all goes to this stuff here called glycogen. And glycogen, for lack of a better word, is good. Okay? Because that's what you want to build in your liver. That's why marathoners pasta load before a marathon race, is to try to up their glycogen stores. But here's alcohol. Here's what alcohol does. You see glycogen anywhere? No glycogen. What happened? Lipid droplet, lots of liver fat, dyslipidemia, this is triglyceride, goes to the adipocyte. That's what causes the problem with alcohol. And you get this inflammation as well, causing the steatohepatitis. Well, here's fructose. You see glycogen anywhere? No glycogen. All comes down here to the mitochondria, gets converted to citrate, drives this de novo lipogenesis pathway here. Some of it won't make it out. It's a lipid droplet. And now you also have hepatic insulin resistance here because of the effect of this compound, JUNK1, on the insulin receptor substrate 1. In addition, you get gluconeogenesis because your insulin now doesn't work to keep your blood sugar down. Now you got hyperglycemia, now you got dyslipidemia, now you got insulin resistance, now you got obesity. And we have shown that the higher the insulin goes, the less well your leptin works. Dr. Johnson introduced the concept of leptin. If your brain can't see its leptin, what happens? Your brain thinks it's starving, and so you eat more. So the eating more is not the behavior, it's the result of the biochemistry. The biochemistry came first. The behavior is a result of the biochemistry. And so you can see how fructose can do that. Now, there are people who say, Dr. Lustig, you are full of crap. Because we know that in non-obese fasting people, when we give them fructose, less than 5% of that goes to liver fat. And for this case, that study, that was true. This was 1999, Parks et al. But that's an artifactual effect, because you're taking a normal person and you are taking them fasting. So they're already glycogen depleted, so most of the fructose actually goes to glycogen through a backdoor pathway. If instead you take a non-obese 10-week hypercaloric feed, now all of a sudden it's 10%. And if you take an obese insulin-resistant person fasting, it's 12%. And if you do it together in a non-obese person with concomitant fructose and glucose, look what happens. Here's fructose and glucose compared to fructose or glucose, 3 times higher, and then if you double the dose, you get 6 times as much fat. So it's all in how you do the study. So all the people who say, oh, that Denovo lipogenesis pathway, it doesn't exist, that's rubbish. All you have to do is do it in the right patient. And unfortunately, we're all now the right patients. My colleague, Dr. Jean-Marc Schwartz at UCSF, did a crossover study where he put people on isocaloric diets for 2 weeks at a time, high fructose versus high complex carbs, same number of calories every single day, and here's the lipid fraction on magnetic resonance spectroscopy, 38% increase in liver fat over 2 weeks on the same number of calories, because the fructose drove the liver fat. So how did it get there if it wasn't being made in the liver itself? So that's the first problem. Second problem, here are 5 pictures. They all share one thing in common. Anybody know what it is? They're all brown. They're all brown. 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 The browning reaction, known as the Maillard reaction, is why banana's brown. Okay? It's why you paint barbecue sauce on your ribs before you put them on the cooker. Okay? Gives you that nice brown color. Okay? So here's the deal. You can either roast your meat at 375 degrees for an hour, or you can roast your meat at 98.6 degrees for 75 years. The answer is the same. You get browning. And if you don't believe me, here's newborn rib cartilage here, nice and white. And here's 88-year-old rib cartilage, nice and brown. We're all browning, sitting here as we speak. And if you had a glass of orange juice this morning with breakfast, you are browning 7 times faster. How does this happen? So, the aldehyde group of glucose binds to the amino group of the hemoglobin molecule, for instance, forms this Schiff base, which then spontaneously decomposes, and you get this covalent linkage. This is not enzyme-driven, therefore you can't find it with genetics. This is a non-genetic issue. But it happens with glucose, and it also happens with fructose. And every time it happens, you generate a little hydrogen peroxide, an ROS, a reactive oxygen species. And those reactive oxygen species do damage, cellular damage. So why is fructose so bad? Well, here's glucose and here's glucose, 6-membered ring. Remember 6-membered ring? So here's the space-occupying molecule. Model. This is a happy molecule. It likes to live like this. So at pH 7.4, 37 degrees, 99.2% of the glucose is like this, and this is safe. Only 0.8 is like this, where the aldehyde is shown. But look at fructose. Here's the space-occupying model. 5-membered ring, steric strain, hydroxymethyl groups in axial configuration, button heads with each other. This is not a happy compound. So at pH 7.4, 37 degrees, 97% is in the ring form, 3% is in the linear form, and this reactive keto group is just as damaging as that aldehyde group and does the same thing. So at any given moment, fructose does more damage because it likes to live in the linear form. And that's just shown here. If you take some protein and put it in a test tube, here's how fast glucose makes that reaction go, and here's how fast fructose makes that reaction go. 7 times faster, 100 times the reactive oxygen species. And if you don't think that matters, here's a correlational study showing that the rate of steatosis in the stage of fibrosis is dependent on daily fructose consumption in a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease clinic at Duke. Okay, now correlation. Everybody with me for plausibility and mechanism? Now let's do correlation. Here are the 10 most obese states in the United States. Here are the 10 laziest states in the United States. What's going on over there in Nevada? Can only burn so much energy going like this. Here are the 10 most unhappy states. Here's the adult diabetes rate. Here's the adult heart disease rate. And finally, here's soda per capita consumption. What do you see? You see correlation. You see overlap, correlation. But you can't prove directionality. This is a cross-sectional study. So the question is, does sugar cause obesity, laziness, unhappiness, diabetes, and heart disease? Or do obese, unhappy, lazy, diabetic people with heart disease like to drown their sorrows in soda? You can't tell. That's correlation, not causation. Here's what's going on around the world. So the American Heart Association says 150 to 200 calories of added sugar per day. This color blue here. And here's the rest of the world. There you are there in New Zealand. You're pretty bad. Not as bad as us, but pretty bad. Okay, everybody with me? So here's world sugar consumption tripling over the past 50 years. And here's per capita consumption. Notice Brazil. Brazil used to be so poor that they couldn't even afford their own sugar. They were always a sugar producer, you know, the Amazon and all, but they were never a sugar exporter because they couldn't afford their own, a sugar consumer, because they couldn't afford their own sugar. Well, now they can, because now they're a BRIC country, right, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? You know, now they got Embraer jets and biodiesel and World Cups and Olympics, you know, and they got a couple of bucks in their pocket, and you know what? They spend it on sugar, and you know what? They got the highest rate of increase of type 2 diabetes in the world today. Not the highest prevalence. Who has the highest prevalence? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Malaysia. Why them? Why them? No alcohol, right? No alcohol. But they got soft drinks like they're going out of style, right? And they drink them with every meal. Why? Well, it's hot, and the water supply is a question mark, and no alcohol. This is their reward. This is how they reward themselves. They reward themselves several times a day. But you know what? I'd rather have alcohol. Because you can only drink yourself under the table once a day. So, again, correlation. This is from the EPIC Interact study. And what it shows is that every sugar-sweetened beverage, 12-ounce can of soda, irrespective of BMI and irrespective of total energy intake, increased diabetes risk by 29%, each soda. And we're not drinking one, we're drinking 2.5. So up that to a total of 55%. So 55% increase based on the soda consumption currently in Europe today. But this is still correlation, but it's got time series data. Okay, finally, causation. The big kahuna, the blow you out of the water, the in your face. This is a study that we did, published last year, where we took 4 international databases. First, the Food and Agriculture Organization Statistics Database, FAO-STAT, which many of you in the room know about. And we looked at total calories, fruits excluding wine, oils, roots, tubers, pulses, nuts, and vegetables as fiber-containing foods, meat, cereals, and then finally sugar, crops, and sweeteners. And we looked at this country by country over the decade, 2000 to 2010. We then melded that with the International Diabetes Federation database for those same countries over the same period of time. And then we melded that with the World Bank Development Indicators database to look at GDP, so poverty, urbanization, aging, physical activity, and finally obesity. So we controlled for all the standard factors related to diabetes. Now, this study has come under attack by people who say, this is an ecological analysis. It's a country-by-country analysis, and therefore it is of low quality. It is of meaningless value because that is not the way to do studies. So, they're wrong. And here's why they're wrong. Because it's not an ecological study. It's called an econometric study. It is country by country, that's true. But we take the time factor into it, and we use some very complex statistical analyses. This is actually how you predict stock market crashes. Okay? And 2 people won the Nobel Prize for doing this. So an ecological study would be prevalence by country, that's true. One point in time, we have multiple points in time. A single relationship, when we have multiple complex interrelationships with internal and external motivating factors all factored in. And this computes a correlation with an adjustment, and this can compute causation because you can employ something known as the Granger causality test. In order to prove causation, you have to demonstrate precedence. You have to show that something came before something else. That's the legal definition of proximate cause. You can't do that in a standard ecological study, but you can in an econometric study. So we have 175 countries, complete data for 154. The 21 were not different by the Hausman test. So generalized estimating equations with a conservative fixed effect approach called the Hausman test, a hazard model to control for selection bias called the Heckman test. This is the one that matters. The Granger causality test, the longitudinal data to determine what preceded what. Did the change in sugar precede the change in diabetes, or did the change in diabetes precede the change in sugar? That's the question. We have the decade, we have the movie. Okay? And we controlled for all the things I told you about. So here's what the data show. Diabetes went up 5.5 to 7% over that period of time worldwide. And here's the effects model for sugar. The overall effects model, taking all of it factors into account. Every 100 calories increased diabetes prevalence by 0.87%. Here's the adjusted association model with sugar with diabetes prevalence, adjusting for all the factors I told you about. This is your take home. This is the slide that counts. This is the big kahuna. This is the in-your-face slam dunk. You can't touch this. Only changes in sugar availability predicted changes in diabetes prevalence. Only sugar. For every 150 calories extra the world ate, diabetes prevalence went up by a total of 0.1%. Nothing. But if those 150 calories happened to be a can of soda instead, diabetes prevalence increased 11-fold by 1.1%. And we're not consuming 1 can, we're consuming 2.5. So take that up to 25% of diabetes in the world is explained by sugar and sugar alone, and in America it's 29%. You want something actionable? Here it is. This study meets the Austin-Bradford-Hill criteria, which for causal medical inference. Now, who here believes that tobacco causes lung cancer? Anybody? Why? Got a control group? Anybody ever perform a randomized control trial? You still believe it. Why? Think about it. Why?
Association.
It's not association. It's way better than association. We have causal medical inference. Who here believes in climate change? Why? Got a control group? Got a randomized control trial, do you? The point is that only 10% of what we know in medicine today is randomized control trials, known as scientific proof. Only 10%. The rest of what we know is 90% of it is causal medical inference, because you can show causation via studies like this. This is causal medical inference for sugar causing diabetes, not associated, causation. Now, there are limitations to this kind of study, one called the ecological fallacy. That is, who said the people who got the diabetes were the people who drank the soda, right? Garbage, because this was about supply. It was about world sugar supply, not about consumption. So somebody was eating it, and it doesn't matter who. So the ecological fallacy is a fallacy. It's irrelevant to this study. It's about supply, not about consumption. So who cares? Bottom line, there are limitations, but none of them take away from the robustness of this data set and this finding. Now, so just so you don't think I'm fructocentric, there are actually 4 items that are metabolized the same way in the liver and cause the same liver fat problem, and here they are. Trans fats, branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine, which you get from corn-fed beef, chicken, and fish, which is a big deal in America. Alcohol, and finally, fructose. All of those are metabolized to liver fat for energy, and all of them cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And they're all issues, but fructose is the one that the food industry adds specifically for its own purposes, not for yours. The reason that these 4 do this is because the liver is the only site for energy metabolism. It's not insulin regulated, there's no glycogen pop-off, and as Dr. Johnson told you, the mitochondria are overwhelmed, and that's what metabolic syndrome is mitochondrial overload in whatever tissue it happens in. When your mitochondria get overloaded, bad things happen. Those reactive oxygen species, the liver fat, etc. That's what's the problem. And the reason this happens is because a calorie is not a calorie. Now, who here would argue that or take issue with a calorie is not a calorie? We'll take it outside. So here's how we think metabolic syndrome goes. Fructose comes in, gets the Maillard reaction, causes reactive oxygen species, gets metabolized in the mitochondria to reactive oxygen species, also lays down visceral fat, the inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6, bind to NADPH oxidase receptor, the receptor which is coupled to NADPH oxidase generates more reactive oxygen species. So you have an ROS pool in your liver or in your pancreas or somewhere else, and that has to be quenched, that has to be detoxified. And they go to the peroxisome to die. That's where you take care of the ROSs. And that's why TZDs work in diabetes, is because they up the peroxisomes so you can quench more ROSs. But if you can't quench them, then they go to the endoplasmic reticulum where they interfere with the folding of proteins known as the unfolded protein response, also known as ER stress, and that causes cell death and cell metabolic dysfunction. In addition, you got the lipid droplets that are being made because you can't export the stuff out, and that's driving the insulin receptor to not do its job. Now you've got insulin resistance and cellular aging, and now you've got metabolic syndrome. And fructose does it better than every other compound. Not the only compound, but the best one for doing it. The American Heart Association, we say reduction from 22 teaspoons to 9 or 6. 9 for males, 6 for females. That's a reduction by 2/3 to 3/4. The American Diabetes Association says we don't even care. We don't even care. That's what they say. So here's what our food dollars have done over the past 30 years, 1982, 2012. Meats, down 10% because we were all told to go low fat. Fruits and vegetables, exactly the same. No change, no difference. They all say eat your fruits and vegetables. We're eating just as much as we ever did. Grains and baked goods, 13 to 14%, and that's an issue because now your insulin goes up. Dairy products, 13.2% down to 10.6%, because we're all now lactose intolerant. Processed foods and sweets, 11.6 up to 22.9%, a doubling in the past 30 years. There's your smoking gun. This is what has changed. This is what is driving this through these reactions that we've just talked about. So in summary, added sugar promotes weight gain. I don't think anyone will argue that point. Added sugar is a cause, not the cause of obesity, but I don't care because it's not about obesity. Fructose promotes unique metabolic characteristics that promote cellular damage, and it meets the definition of toxicity because it damages the organism chronically. It does it through de novo lipogenesis, liver fat, browning reaction, and cellular aging, which I've shown you all of them. Added sugar is an independent risk factor for diabetes, irrespective of its calories, irrespective of its effect on obesity. I've shown you plausibility, mechanism, correlation, and causation. It meets the definition for scientific and legal criteria for proximate cause. And don't think that we won't be using that in the future as policy issues and also legal issues go forward. Sugar is associated with all the diseases of the metabolic syndrome, as Dr. Johnson told you. Sugar is the alcohol of the child. They don't drink alcohol. They drink this instead. And they're getting the same diseases as adults for the same reasons, through the same mechanisms. And we currently consume triple our limit. We have a limit. We have how much our mitochondria can burn. And when you go over that limit, you generate liver fat and all the other phenomena that I just described. And it's been placed in our food surreptitiously, insidiously, by the food industry for its own purposes, not for ours. 3 months from today, a movie will be released in America called Fed Up. You need to put this on your calendars when it comes to New Zealand, and you need to go see it. It is a documentary narrated and executive produced by Katie Couric and Laurie David, and it will describe the 35-year conspiracy between the food industry and the US government to provide disinformation on dietary guidelines and what we should eat in order to make money for the food industry. And this will be its expose. If there isn't a call to action that can work internationally, if this isn't it, I don't know what is. So my questions to you. are, can our toxic food environment be changed without government or societal intervention, especially when there are potentially addictive substances involved, as you'll hear about from Dr. Rooney? And can we afford to wait to enact public health measures when healthcare worldwide will be bankrupt due to total chronic metabolic disease? We got to do something. Doing nothing is not an option. We got to do something. We have all the data we need to argue that this is job one. And that's what this symposium is about, and that's why I'm happy to be here. If you need further reading on the subject, here are some books that will help you along with that. And we have started a nonprofit to take on big food. We're providing medical, nutritional, and legal analysis and consultation to promote personal and public health against big food, called the Institute for Responsible Nutrition, called responsiblefoods.org. Please sign up. We will keep you abreast of what's going on. We need your help. We all have to sing with one voice. Otherwise, it's just noise. With that, I want to thank my collaborators, and I will be happy to answer any questions.